Well, the first thing, I suppose, introducing this talk, just to begin with a question, and that is, why bother? Why bother with Jesus and the Jesus story? Well, apart from enjoying myself when I've not been at a meeting today, listening to Radio 3 and broadcast of Christmas music from Latvia and Russia and Greece and you name it, all over Europe. The fact of the matter is that billions of people are notionally Christian, and within that there are many, 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 many millions who are devout believers. So I think formally there are well over 1 billion Catholics, for example. But also, it's just worth saying, isn't it, that, most of us here, I would guess, out of the 14 people now signed up for this talk, most of us will live in Europe. And Europe, at least in recent years, certainly in Britain, you know, the numbers going to church has constantly declined, and although you know, still many people will sign themselves on some census form if they have religion, they'll tick Christian or something along those lines. The fact of the matter is that religion is still a potent force, not least in the United States. So it's not that Trump, for example, the last president, was in any way that I know of religious. On the other hand, his vice president, Mike Pence, is one of these people, you know, who believe in the second coming, you know, believe in, you know, the word of the Bible is the word of God. And if we think about the next presidential election, while it's possible that Trump might run, it's also quite conceivable that we end up with what I would call a Christian fanatic in the White House. You know, if you're in America, that is quite a conceivable outcome of an election. And if you think about their belief system, if it was to be put into practice, it's quite chilling. And obviously not only for those that live in the Middle East, but on a global scale, simply because the United States is the global hegemon and is armed with apocalyptic nuclear weapons. Anyway, again, just scratching my head and saying, okay, you know, I've been surrounded wall to wall today with Christian songs and, you know, singing about the nativity and the Jesus story. Just worthwhile thinking about it historically, and just note the fact that the Christian fanatic, Oliver Cromwell, and those around him, i.e. the Puritans, well knew that this Christmas story that has been celebrated year after year after year, seemingly for, what is it, 2021 years, or let's give it a wait for the guy to die sort of idea, but you get the idea. Let's say near to for 2000 years. He knew it was all a load of nonsense, and he knew that Jesus wasn't born on Christmas Day. You know, he knew that the date was plumped on, I think it was 400 years after, something like that, 400 years after the supposed event. It was plumped on in the Vatican, and it was designed to still the Roman Saturnalia. And of course, the Roman Saturnalia itself was designed to still previous religions. But the point would be, here we are, we're at the end of the year of where we get the darkest days. And certainly in our sort of climate, The masses go out traditionally and look forward to the new year. There's very little to do agriculturally, so they have a party. And basically the Christians move in on this. And as I said, Oliver Cromwell was well aware of this, along with loads of other saint days in reality were stolen from previous religions. Either way, because he knew that and he thought this was all idolatrous, he actually banned Christmas, which of course didn't go down well, not only amongst Catholics, but amongst the masses, because for them, as I said, Christmas was a time for enjoyment, a time for celebration, a time to get drunk, to have a party. And indeed, if you look at the pre-Cromwellian calendar in Britain, you know, there were a huge number of saint days. And as I said, this was a time to, you know, stop work and have fun. And so the Puritans come in, and obviously they represent, from a Marxist point of view, a capitalist force, and they're not interested in partying. They're interested in getting people to work and doing the right thing. Either way, the point would be, and this is what I'm trying to say, is that Christmas is a largely mythologized story. And it's true, as I understand it, that if you take the Wee Frees, which is a sort of Protestant sect up in Scotland, that's what they're called, the Wee Frees, the Free Presbyterians up in Scotland, they still refuse to celebrate Christmas because they know that it's a myth, that it's made up. Of course, that still presumes that what they believe in, from my angle at least, is equally mythological. Okay, so what I'm going to do with this talk is to try to separate the myth from what is probably reality. So what I'm going to put forward in terms of my argument, of course, isn't the truth. Well, we'll never know the truth, but I think we can arrive at something near the truth that will actually cast a light on the Christian religion and, of course, the individual that sits at the center of the Christian religion. Now, it has been argued in the past, and I don't dismiss it in any absolute sense, that Jesus himself was a completely made up figure, that he never existed. And it's certainly true that if you take contemporary sources, which we have, which tend to be very fragmentary, but nonetheless, we do have plenty of ancient sources, that no contemporary, when he was alive, mentioned Jesus. So there he is, according to the story. You know, his birth is accompanied by the massacre of the innocents. Remember, King Herod was told this prophecy by the wise men who were following this star, that a new king of Israel was going to be born. And he basically said, well, I'm king of Israel. So, well, if a new king's going to be born, I'll kill them all. So he orders the killing of all these young firstborn babies. Meanwhile, we have the story that an angel came down and told Mary and Joseph to scuttle out of it. We're also told that at the age of 12, Jesus went to the Jerusalem temple and engaged in highly sophisticated theological disputes with the high priests and beat them. We're also told that Jesus's first miracle was to turn water into wine, as well as raising the dead, and himself having been killed, having gone to hell, that's what it says in the Bible, rose back to life, and basically carried on performing miracles for those 3 days. And I could carry on. Now, all I can say is in spite of all those fantastic events, no one in the Roman world, no one in the contemporary Jewish world said, bloody hell, look what this guy can do. Look at this guy. We've got to start writing down his story. No, nothing of the sort. And so just to make the point, here's a book that's sort of contemporary with Jesus. It's called The Jewish Antiquities, and it's by a guy called Josephus. And Josephus was one of the military leaders. He was an aristocrat. He was one of the military leaders of the Jewish Revolution, which happened, you know, if we believe the Bible story, something like 30 years after the death of Jesus. And anyway, the point would be that he defected from the Jewish side and went over to the Romans. And while he was in favor, he wrote two famous books, and one was called, got it here somewhere. Well, I haven't got it somewhere. Anyway, one was called The Jewish War, which was basically his experience of the Jewish uprising, the siege of Jerusalem, where he stood outside the walls. And this, The Jewish Antiquities, is basically an account of Jewish beliefs going back to Adam and coming up to his own time. And what's interesting about it, presumably, is that some medieval priests, this was called also for many, many years, the Second Bible, right? So this is an important book because Christians looked at it and found confirmation of their ideas. What we now know is there is a mention of Jesus in this book, but we now know from, you know, computer analysis, but logic it also tells us that this was put in, this was inserted somewhere in the medieval period. So you've got a passage in here about the Jews killing this guy called Jesus, who was truly the Son of God. And Voltaire, for example, commenting on this book, says, Josephus just could never write that. It's just impossible that he could write it. So, you know, Voltaire, simply knowing, you know, the Jewish thought world rejected it as a forgery. So the question is, why insert it? Well, as I said, you know, if you're a Christian and all these miracles are happening, it's quite annoying, isn't it? That, say, you know, a few decades after this Son of God was on earth walking about performing all these miracles, someone like Josephus doesn't even notice him, doesn't even mention him. But what we've got, strangely, in this book, which isn't a forgery, is mention of a guy called James, right? James, who's head of a party in Jerusalem called the Nazarenes, right? A very pious sect, this one is. And this guy, James, he's actually executed, he's killed, I think in the 50s. So this is before the Jewish Revolution. The ideas of James, the ideas of the Nazarenes are certainly seen by Josephus as laying or part of the laying down of the ideology that the Jewish Revolution is fought out with. In other words, you know, ideas aren't just something we think, they're also something we fight out interests with. So what we also have with Josephus, which is very useful to us, is a description of what he calls the parties that existed in pre-revolutionary Judea. He describes the royal faction, the Herodians. These are people that the Romans put in. These are people that are only semi-Jewish. They come from the south. They're basically Greekized, Hellenized. The ancient world in the Mediterranean is crudely dividable into two: a Greek-speaking east and a Latin-speaking West. So even in the Roman Empire, you still have that division. So in Palestine, you don't just have Jews, you have an awful lot of Greeks or people influenced by Greek culture, which goes back to Alexander the Great and continues really until the Muslim takeover. Anyway, my main point is that these people are seen by ordinary Jewish people in Judea as convent breakers. These people are seen as mixing with foreigners, as ritualistically unclean. We also have, in terms of his description of the groupings that existed at the time, a party that he calls the Sadducees. These are the high priests. How many high priests were there? Roughly speaking, 1,500 in Jerusalem itself. Remember, we have a religion here that's centered on one temple. And we can get into an argument about synagogues and all the rest of it. But we have a temple cult which would resemble something like a slaughterhouse. So, you're meant to pilgrimage to Jerusalem. You're meant to sacrifice animals when you get there. And the priests are in charge of sacrificing animals and taking tithes. But we also know that we have a very rapid differentiation amongst the priest caste, and we have basically a dozen families seizing control of the priesthood and the tithes. But we also have a situation where the Romans are seizing hold of who's going to be the high priest. And we have the guy before Pontius Pilate, for example, getting rid of 3 high priests. So in terms of what these guys thought, we don't know, but we can hazard a guess. They didn't believe that the dead would rise at the end of the days. They didn't believe in miracles. They believed in the world balance of forces, and they didn't think that little Judea could take on and beat the Roman Empire. So from their point of view, they were reluctant collaborators with Rome, not enthusiasts like the royal family and the Hellenized section of the population. But basically, it was a shrug of the shoulders. Well, we recognize, who's in charge. We recognize the balance of power here. We've got to collaborate with these people, but we don't like it. So on the one side, you've got collaboration with the Romans. And on the other hand, you've got them resisting those below. They don't like notions of democracy, if we can use that word. They don't like the masses. These people consider themselves more than a cut above, the common herd. Josephus also then describes the Pharisees. Now, if you read Karl Kautsky and his Foundations of Christianity, and if you read this very, very good book, I have to say that it was an eye-opener to me. This is a guy called Hyman Maccabee. They view the Pharisees as what they would call the popular party. And it's certainly the case that whereas the Sadducees, the high priests, had reduced themselves basically to a dead religion, that their only job was to preside over a frozen set of ceremonies and to read out a series of texts that had been frozen with the returnees from Babylon many years before. So the Pharisees were very skilled at debating the law and bending it to fit the needs of life. On the other hand, and I have to say, I was convinced by his account, this guy, I'm going to be waving around a few books this evening. This is Robert Eisenman. Who's he? He was one of the first people to translate, and he took the lead in leaking the Dead Sea Scrolls. If some of you old enough might remember the sort of storm that caused. Here's a translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Catholic Church sat on these texts that have been discovered in caves in southern Israel by some shepherd, I think shepherd boy. And it turned out that these scrolls were religious, and they go back basically to the time of Jesus and before and a little bit after. The scrolls seem to have been squirreled away in these caves, roughly speaking, something like 66 AD, a significant event. This is the beginning of the Jewish Revolution, and it seems that the community that wrote those documents was wiped out or sought refuge in Jerusalem, but basically that was the end of its life. Well, Robert Eiserman argues that the Pharisees weren't the popular party. He looks at the Dead Sea Scrolls and he says, no, these people weren't the popular party. Again, what we've got is collaborators. These people are after smooth things. These people don't want to confront the Romans. These people are actually people that are against the popular interest of the masses. Interestingly, having described the various factions, I think he calls them the three parties. He actually says, well, there is a fourth, the fourth philosophy. And this is the most interesting section of his description. The rest are pretty short and pretty crisp. Actually, it turns out the fourth philosophy is the most extensive. And the reason he can write so fully about the fourth philosophy is actually because although he was an aristocrat, he seems to have been an initiate of a party that he calls the Essenes in his youth. And he seems to be writing about them because I would guess this will be entertaining for his Latin speaking audience. He's writing in Latin, he's not writing in obviously Hebrew or Amharic. I don't think he was writing in Greek, first of all, so he's writing for the entertainment of the upper classes in Rome. Anyway, he describes these people living out in camps in the desert and living what he calls, quote unquote, a religious and communist life. They share everything in common. They elect their leadership. They don't have sex, apparently, although some other groups in that thought world do, but only for purposes of making children. What's also interesting about these people is they're organized into tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands. Whether the thousand is real or not, I don't know. But they're organized along the lines of a figure from what we will call, or I would call, because of my cultural background, the Old Testament, a guy called Gideon, who fought the enemies of the people of Israel, I think with basically a handful of people, but with legions of angels. Now, if we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's not the same group as the Essenes, but it really is. It's the equivalent, I suppose, of the difference between the Socialist Party in England and Wales and I don't know what you want to call it, the SWP or the ISG or Workers' Power of old, or they still exist, don't they? Workers' Power. So it's within that sort of how should I put it, body of thought. And what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls is clearly the idea that we're organizing along military lines, waiting to overthrow what the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Kittim. And the Kittim, quite clearly from the context, is the Romans. And basically what they believe at the end of times, which will be coming very, very soon, God will intervene in human affairs, and the people of Israel will be organized, all the pure will be organized in military units. They will take on the Romans, and with the military aid of the angels They will massacre the Roman armies, and henceforth God's will rule. The people of Israel are the vanguard, and what they have, depending on which text you look at, is either one Messiah or two. Sometimes the Messiah plays a religious role. On the other hand, another Messiah in the text plays the role of leading the army. Now, in terms of this fourth philosophy, Eisman argues that this is actually the popular party. And within the popular party, as well as having the Essenes and the people that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are a sort of faction of a faction, something along those lines, we also have what he calls the Jesus Party, or the Nazarenes. And the Nazarenes, the name doesn't come, according to him, from the little town in Galilee that Jesus was supposed to live in. It basically means pure. And his argument that if there was a Nazareth at the time, it gets the name via the party, as opposed to the party getting the name from the town. Either way, this party calls itself by many different names: the poor, the pure, the zealot, the Nazarenes, i.e., again, a purity type name. And his basic argument is that if we look not only at this one, the Jewish antiquities, but other literature immediately after this was written, and it's an extensive literature, his argument is we actually have James here, a description of him leading the Jesus Party. He's the brother of Jesus. We have a description of his religious outlook, and it's highly xenophobic. He doesn't like foreigners. He doesn't tolerate people, breaking the Sabbath or breaking the dietary codes. They worship in the temple. But basically what they claim to be is we are pure priests, as opposed to the collaborators with Rome. And we know, not only from this book, but from other sources, that at least on one occasion, James takes over the Yom Kippur ceremony in the temple. So he seems to have acted, at least at one point in his career, as a dual power high priest. He might have done that on several occasions, but the design of the temple, you have one room where God is meant to dwell, and only the high priest can go in once a year. This is something James did. Remember the story of the Romans going into the temple, and they go into this Holy of Holies, and they open the doors, and their response was, bugger me, there's nothing here. Where if you went to a Roman temple or Greek temple, you'd have a big statue of Jove or Jupiter or Athena. In the Jewish temple, it's empty. And they say, what the hell are these people worshipping? Where's their God? Either way, that's James for you. Well, what we have is not James participating in the Jewish revolution, but people who are of his party participating in it. We know all about the Jewish revolution. In modern Jerusalem, you can go up to the walls, that the pious still pray before. You can go and look at the remains of the temple. You can go to the Temple Mount. You can go to Masada, of where they took their last stand in AD 74, and see the Roman earthworks that enabled them to besiege and eventually take this desert fortress. So we know a great deal about this time, but also what we have afterwards is the beginning of what I think we can start to legitimately call the Christian religion. And the founder of that Christian religion, of course, isn't Jesus, because if we know James The argument is we know Jesus, we know his brother, and what these people are is pious Orthodox Jews of the time, ultra Orthodox from their point of view, and they are people who are capable of coming up with new stories, inventing stories that deal with their contemporary period. So who's the founder of modern Christianity, the religion? Well, of course, the founder of modern Christianity is Paul, who previously was named Saulus, and you can read all about him in the Bible, the Holy Bible. And again, it's just worthwhile just making a point about this book. Well, the bulk of it, of course, is what, from my culture, you'd call the Old Testament. So what we have in terms of the arrangement of the Bible, at least my version of it, is the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You all know that. And then we have the Acts. And what's worthwhile knowing is that the Acts are actually the first to be written. They're the earliest document, not the last, the sort of at the end of the book. Actually, if you're going to arrange the book chronologically, you would put the Act. I'm talking about the New Testament. You would put the Acts first instead of at the end, right? What's interesting about the Acts is, well, from our point of view now, is the honesty of it. This is meant to be the work of Paul. Well, you need to take that not with a pinch, but with the view that anything that was inconvenient might well have been overwritten. Or on the other hand, and I think this is also a factor, what had become so well known to this party, and I'll leave aside an exact description of it for the moment, couldn't be changed. So, for example, as well as having the four canonical Gospels that we all know, we also have a work by James. And what's interesting about the work by James, for example, is that it's the most violent in terms of its class hatred of the poor for the rich. It's most violent in terms of what's going to happen to those, it didn't use terms like that, but the rich bastards when we get our revenge on them. This is what God is going to do to you. Unless you repent and give us all your wealth, you are cursed, and you're cursed to, hellfire. And only the poor are blessed, right? You recognize the sort of poor who will inherit the world. The poor in spirit. One of these. What the fuck is that? What's the poor in spirit? Someone who's a bit depressed. No, James is quite explicit. It's the poor that will inherit the world, and we will get revenge on the rich. So what's interesting about Paul and the Acts is his description, his self-description of chasing the James party as it's fleeing Jerusalem in order to persecute them. Right, so he's participating in this persecution of the Jesus party, and you know the story. I mean, I obviously don't accept it, but this is his version of it. You all know, on the road to Jerusalem, he sees the light, he goes blind, and he sees visions of Jesus, and he becomes, well, I use the word a convert. Okay, so you don't need to take that particular story. Either way, yes, he becomes a convert. That's his version of it. So he goes from Saulus, the persecutor, the pro-Roman, pro-aristocratic persecutor of the Jesus party. He sees the light. And then his own description is he goes to Jerusalem and he meets the heads of the church, and he meets James, the brother of the Lord, And he also meets other brothers of the Lord. And we're not talking about, like we in the CPGB are brothers and sisters together. He's talking about biology. Jesus was the oldest brother, and James was acting as regent, because unlike earlier revolutionary leaders that litter the pages of the Jewish wars of Josephus, there are all sorts of bandits, there are all sorts of zealots, there are all sorts of revolutionary uprisings, some of which are successful temporarily. What we have in the person of Jesus is the story, our leader was killed, our leader was buried, but our leader rose from the dead and at the moment lives up in heaven, and you can't get him. And we're here carrying on his fight, carrying on his message. There are similar stories in the Old Testament with various prophets. But what was significant about Jesus, and I haven't mentioned this yet, what was significant about him is he wasn't just someone who was aspiring to become a prophet king of Israel. You had that with, from my memory, Saul, David, Solomon. These were prophet kings. So it's in the, in the mythologized history of this people. What he was proclaiming himself as is the Messiah king, the last king. And what he meant by that wasn't as it has it in the so-called New Testament. What he has it is that he is the legitimate king of Israel, as opposed to this pro-Roman upstart who's been installed, in the palace in Jerusalem. And he is claiming to be directly of the line of David, the first great king of Israel. He claims to be biologically of that line. So it's a bit like some peasant, some Anglo-Saxon peasant under the Normans claiming, I'm really the son of King Harold that was killed in Hastings in 1066. And don't you know he had a son? I'm his grandson. I'm the real king of England. But of course, what Jesus was proclaiming and what his party was proclaiming is that this was some sort of holy, divinely blessed royal house, the revolutionary vanguard that would liberate all humanity. And therefore, it's interesting that two testaments of the Christian Bible have a long genealogy of Jesus. And obviously, we all know who his father was, don't we? It wasn't the big G, it was the big J, Joseph. And Joseph was of the line of David. And they trace him back all through these people, all the way to David. And then after that, all the way back to Adam, because we're all related to Adam, aren't we? But we're not all related to David. And another version has a different genealogy. But nonetheless, we're not taking the genealogy seriously. But what we're saying is that they took the genealogy seriously because of the claim of Jesus to be of the royal house of David. And so, again, this is just worthwhile investigating, therefore, this strange story in the New Testament about Jesus's birth, which is clearly an invention. Remember, according to the story, the Romans, for some unknown, bizarre reason, decide to conduct a census. Well, there's nothing strange in that. We've got the Doomsday Book and other such documents, and this is done for purposes of taxation. How many people have I got? What estates have they got? What can I screw out of them? But according to the Bible, what happens is you're all meant to go back to your place of birth. Imagine that. I mean, even in the ancient world, that would have been a crazy thing to do. But it allows the writers of this book to say that Jesus and Joseph came from this town called Bethlehem. which is the historic capital of the Davidic line. And so, you know, again, you have in the Bible, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem in his final days, the crowds are greeting him as Son of David, Hosanna, save us, right? And he goes to the temple. Well, that seems to ring true. And if we look at, as I said, at the Acts, this is what these people believe, that, yeah, Jesus is being killed, but he's up there and he's waiting for us. And what's interesting about the Acts is the hostility that Paul finds because he's a previous persecutor. Do we really trust this guy? And basically, he cuts a deal. He must have been a very talented individual. He cuts a deal with James, and basically what it is, look, Paul, as you're now calling yourself, that's a Romanized word, but you get the point, Paulus, or whatever your name happens to be, you go off and proselytize the message. You take the message to non-Jews, because we want all good people coming in, but your job is to convert them. They are second rate. They're not top grade vanguard material. Nevertheless, we would welcome these people as fellow believers. You go off and you go out and win these people to the idea of Jesus. And lo and behold, that's what he does. And you've got his various letters to the Corinthians and to whoever else it happens to be, and he goes out and converts people. He's persecuted. He has to get away here. He has to do this and that there. Either way, after some time, he comes back, and the story about him has already arrived. And this again is his own description. He arrives in Jerusalem and he is not Mr. Popular. The masses don't like him, and they don't like him not because of his previous, role of persecution. They don't like him because what he's been saying to these converts is you don't have to get circumcised, saying that to the men. You don't have to get circumcised. You don't really need to observe all of these dietary fads that these ultra Jews have in Jerusalem and Judea. You don't really. What you really need to do is believe in Jesus. I've seen Jesus. I had a vision of Jesus, and Jesus can talk directly to you. You don't need priests. You don't need arch priests to tell you what the message of Jesus is. So that story comes back to Jerusalem, and what we have is a description by Paul himself about how he has to be smuggled out by the James party out of Jerusalem to ensure his safety. Right? So this is his own description of the brother and brothers of Jesus and what they believed and what their thought world was, as opposed to the emerging belief system that Paul represents. Anyway, to cut a long story short, because I've already spoken for 3/4 of an hour and I don't want to do it. To cut a long story short, after both Paul and James are dead in 66 AD, there's a Jewish revolt, and it proves to be remarkably successful. And it also proves in their own thought world to be almost miraculous, because they actually ambush a Roman army that's retreating from Jerusalem. Why it's retreating from Jerusalem, I actually don't know. Might have been supply. I just don't know. Maybe it was popular resistance. I just don't know. Either way, they're retreating from Jerusalem. This is a Roman army, the most fearsome military machine in the world. And the zealot guerrilla forces massacre their rear guard. And only the head of the army can escape. And they basically think, Jesus Christ, we've done it. This is not quite miraculous because it was our guerrilla tactics. Either way, there's a general uprising. And Roman rule comes to an end. But of course, the Romans are very quick to respond, and they send a much more powerful army. And what you get is precisely people like Josephus going, well, to hell with this. I'm swapping sides. The revolution is squeezed in to Jerusalem. So we don't know how big Jerusalem was, but if you said 100,000 people, it might be accurate. And you could swell that. Maybe you could double that size with refugees coming in from the countryside. These are very rough figures. In the ancient world, they tended to exaggerate massively numbers. Either way, the revolution continues. And what's interesting about it is, having initially been in the hands of people like Josephus, rational, thinking, worldly individuals, the revolution falls into the hands of the fourth party, in particular into the hands of various zealot. These were sort of guerrilla fighters that have a religious ideology. This was born, I think, something like 164 BC, that party. Either way, what happens is they do what people might say typical left. They break up into factions, and they each defend their own wall. So Jerusalem has got a whole number of different walls, inner walls, outer walls. Each faction and their rivals are defending their own bit of the wall. And the most militant faction is actually Republican. They don't want a God, a God-chosen king. They don't take any instructions from kings or any other human being. They only take instructions from God. They're also committed, according to Josephus, to abolish slavery. They will not hold slaves. So these are extreme radicals. Either way, we know, again, this is all fully testified, not only by Josephus, not only by the archaeology, but by many other Roman and other contemporary writers, that eventually the Romans breach the walls. And I think it takes them weeks and weeks to finally put down Jerusalem. And they massacre and they take the handsomest fighters back to Rome, where they ritualistically sacrifice them in the Forum. And you've seen the carvings of them carrying, the holy symbols from the temple. They raise the place as much as they can to the ground. This is an object now of looting and rape, and that's what the Romans do. And what's interesting is that there's a story in the Talmud. I don't know whether it's accurate, but the story is that some, I'll call him a rabbi. I won't push my luck. Just a teacher, gets himself smuggled out, and he presents himself, I think, to Vespasian, who's the future emperor. His father is the Emperor Titus. He's been left in charge of doing down Jerusalem. He basically says, look, I'll refound Judaism for you. And some sort of deal is struck. The temple is destroyed. And it's from that date, we definitely know that the temple cult goes and modern Judaism comes forth. So we have synagogues. We don't have animal sacrifice. We don't have a central focus of worship. We have a localization of the religion. So modern Judaism, from all strands, is born with the defeat of the temple cult in AD 70. But also what is born is modern Christianity. Various fragments of the Jesus party seem to have survived, and indeed you can find some elements of them throughout the Middle East, some sort of watered down, some sort of refashioned versions. But what really triumphs is the Paul party, and they disassociate themselves from the Jewish revolution, and you get then a writing of the four modern Gospels. And what's noticeable about all these four Gospels is that this guy, at the center of it, Jesus, is portrayed as a pacifist. So I've got nothing to do with swords. I've got nothing to do with violence. I'm not here to, don't resist evil. He's someone who's pro-Roman. The first person to recognize him being the Son of God was the bloody centurion there, who's executing him. That's the first person who says, "That, don't you know who that is? That's the Son of God." All the way through, we also have him mixing with prostitutes, drinking alcohol, all stuff that we know James despised. James would never have mixed with prostitutes, would never have mixed with Romans unless he couldn't help it. Boasted of his lifelong virginity and also lifelong what we would call teetotalism. So in the Bible, we have a Jesus that's pro-alcohol, first miracle, turning water to wine, someone who mixes freely with the unclean, someone who mixes with the Romans. And indeed, think about the last days of Jesus. There he is performing miracles. He thought the end of the world was about to come. It didn't succeed. He goes outside of the walls to the Garden of Gethsemane, and it's one of his own. It's Judas, who's actually more likely to be one of his brothers, that betray him, gives him a nice smacker on the cheek. Another one of his brothers gets out a sword because Jesus had said in the biblical account, 2 swords will be enough. Presumably they're expecting the angels to come from on high. Cuts off the ear of some servant. Jesus sticks it back on and says, no, we're not in. Anyway, Jesus is humiliated. He's put on trial, and they have this strange ceremony, apparently, don't believe it, of where Pontius Pilate, the chief Roman, is meant to abide by this ceremony. We'll free you a prisoner. Who do you want? Do you want Barabbas, the thief, or do you want Jesus, the holy Jesus, who the crowds have just been proclaiming, remember, as he comes in on an ass, fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah or someone else from the old books, but he's on an ass for religious reasons. They are proclaiming him to be son of David. He's going to bring the rule of the Romans to an end. He seizes the temple. He clears out not the money lenders, but the corrupt Sadducee priesthood. The Romans shrug their shoulders. We can deal with this. This isn't a serious uprising. Maybe he's backed by the local zealot, there, no doubt. Either way, we have this trial before Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate turns around and says, who do you want? And the Jews say, we don't want Jesus. Kill him, take him away. And you even have the high priest saying, on our hands, his blood will be with us, and on our children's children's children. One of the blood libels, a curse on all Jews. Jews killed Jesus. And Pontius Pilate, remember, cleans his hands and said, well, it's not on me. So it's the Jews that are responsible, according to the Bible, for the death of one of their liberation fighters. The Romans had no responsibility. After all, what could they do? The Jews had demanded his death, and they just, the point would be that although Nero and various emperors did persecute the Christian church, clearly there was a need in the ancient Roman world, a declining social system, for such a religion, and eventually culminating in Constantine, a deal is done. And although Constantine doesn't convert until his final breaths, because he's tortured and killed and done all sorts of horrible things, so he can be forgiven and go to heaven because he's at last repented. Basically, what you have is a deal where the church, which has become a material force with vast estates, is allowed to become second fiddle in the Roman Empire. It is incorporated into the official ideology of the Roman Empire, and it's precisely Paul's redacted, highly edited version of the Jesus story which becomes the official doctrine. But of course, what we've got there, because so many of these stories are well known, they can only go so far with it. It's a bit like if you take Stalin. He did a very good job on Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, but he could only go so fast. You still had in Russia, I'm not equating it, but you still had the collected works of Lenin, which in the main, they never dared to doctor, So we have elements of that remaining in the Bible, and the key is to know which is nonsense, what's probable, and why the nonsense was introduced, and the significance. We need to tease out the significance of the nonsense, certainly not dismiss it as just made up. It is made up, but ideology has its own life and its own power and its own significance. Anyway, with that, I shall wish you a happy, what did they call it? Yuletide, Xmas, Roman Saturnalia, end of year celebration. Thank you, Stan.